All right, I'll call together the meeting of the Santa Barbara City Finance Committee for February 28th. And the first item on our agenda is the mid-year financial review for fiscal year 2017. Ms. Nemes, are you going to make this presentation?
I am, thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Hart, committee members. I am Julie Nemes. I'm the Treasury Manager for the Finance Department. I am here with Jennifer Tomaszewski. She is the Accounting Manager. And we will be presenting the mid-year financial review for fiscal year 2017. There are 4 areas we will be covering today. I will be focusing on the general fund revenues. Ms. Tomaszewski will be focusing on the general fund expenditures as well as the enterprise fund revenue and expenses, and finally the proposed budget adjustments. So first I will be covering the general fund revenues. This first table is a review of the general fund summary. The table represents the year-to-date budget compared to the year-to-date actuals at 12/31/2016, as well as a comparison of the year-to-date actuals compared to the prior year-to-date actuals at 12/31. I'll be focusing on the year-to-date variance column. As you'll see there, the taxes are showing at 12/31/2016 to be above budget by $4.7 million. This is almost entirely due to timing differences that I'll be getting into in detail in the next slide. The other revenues and fees and charges, those are coming in about $1.2 million below budget at 12/31 for a net of $3.5 million above budget. But as I mentioned, those are almost entirely due to timing differences that I'll be focusing on next. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the taxes are coming in above budget by $4.7 million, almost entirely due to timing differences, and this is almost entirely due to sales and use tax. At the last quarterly investment report, I spent a little time talking about the end of the triple flip, and this is due to this variance of $5 million is due to the end of the triple flip. The triple flip ended last fiscal year, and the final true-up payment of about $2.7 million came in August, and that relates to last fiscal year. So about half of that variance is related to that final true-up payment that relates to the prior fiscal year. The remainder of that variance is due to the end of the triple flip. One of the ramifications of the triple flip is a change in how we receive revenues, and it changes the distribution. The triple flip, when it was in place, we received revenues through property taxes, a portion of sales taxes, and that came in the latter part of the fiscal year, the second half of the fiscal year. So now that the triple flip has ended, we receive sales taxes more evenly. They're more evenly distributed. So about $2.8 million of sales taxes are now being received in the first half of the fiscal year that previously we were received in the second half of the fiscal year. And that makes up the second half of that variance. So really the entire variance, even more than that variance, is due to these timing differences. So when we look at actual sales tax growth for the fiscal year, we have one quarter that we've received as of 12/31, and it's actually below our adopted budget. We have an adopted growth rate of 3%, and it actually came in the first quarter at 2%. So based on current year growth and trends we're seeing with sales tax revenues, we do believe sales tax is actually going to come in below budget by about $450,000. Moving on to property taxes. Property taxes are showing at 12/31 to be about $375,000 below budget. This is almost entirely due to timing difference and distributions from the county. We actually think property taxes will come in above budget by about $120,000. The last variance I wanted to focus on is transient occupancy taxes. It's right now showing about $76,000 below budget at 12/31. This is due to hotel growth not being quite as strong as we had anticipated. We also are predicting additional loss in the second half of the fiscal year due to the short-term rental, vacation rental enforcement, and we predict that the TOT revenue could come in below budget by as much as $700,000. So now that I've explained a little bit about why that year-to-date variance is so high for sales and use tax, I wanted to go back and look at the general fund revenue summary with that sales tax adjustment in there to get a better idea of what the true year-to-date variance is overall. So we talked about in the first slide that year-to-date variance for taxes being $4.7 million, but now we have about a $5.5 million adjustment for the end of the triple flip. This results in a revised year-to-date variance for all the categories, a net total of $2 million below budget. So it went from about 3.5 million to the good to a 2 million below budget. And I did want to note, however, that we do have a few timing differences at 12/31. One example of that would be the property taxes it was purely a timing difference. And so based on data through 12/31, we do think that revenues are coming in below budget at the end of the fiscal year, about 2.5 million total, not 4 million if you doubled that. Moving on to other revenues.
Can we stop for just 1 second?
Absolutely.
That was a lot to digest.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the 2.5 million number, that's, can you tell me where that is?
Yes. So the boxed column, the revised year-to-date variance, the 2 million all the way at the bottom, that is what we're showing right now as of 12/31. But if we doubled that, it would be 4 million. And I didn't want to give you that number because we have some timing differences at 12/31 that will not, they don't double up by the end of the year. So based on all of the data that I have at 12/31, I'm projecting the total revenues below budget at the end of the year would be about 2.5 million. So it's not going to equate it all the way to the 4 million. But things could change in the second half of the fiscal year. So that's not an absolute number, but that's based on information I have right now.
So at June 30th, if what we're looking at now stays true, we're going to be looking at a $2.5 million variance.
Based on information through 12/31, correct.
Okay. And you said in the previous slide that TOT is going to be about 700,000 or could be $700,000 lower than we expected.
Property taxes, about 700,000. Transient occupancy taxes, about $700,000 below budget, correct.
For the fiscal year.
For the fiscal year, correct.
And even though we're only showing 76,000 lower now, and that's because you think TOTs for the second half will shrink?
Due to the short-term rental enforcement in the second half of the fiscal year, we think that that could have an impact on TOT, primarily due to vacation rental TOT returns.
So I thought I read that we only collected about 75,000 in TOT in the last, was it 6 months or was it the last month? Maybe that's where I'm mixing up my numbers. How much have we been collecting lately with the TOT for STRs for the short-term rentals?
You know, what we collect on a monthly basis depends on the month. Short-term rental TOT returns they vary a lot because a lot of short-term rental operators, it's when a lot of them, it's when they go out of town is when they will rent out their home. So it really varies a lot month to month. I don't recall what the last month was, but we do see a lot of it during the summer months.
Okay. Yeah, so 700,000 just struck me as large for a 6-month period for TOTs for short-term rentals this late into their kind of sunsetting.
We are showing a total loss of TOT, vacation rental TOT returns in the second half of the fiscal year. And it was about 1.3 million is what we earn in short-term rental TOT in one fiscal year.
And we hadn't budgeted that in for this fiscal year?
We had budgeted part of it, but not all of it.
Okay. And then the property tax, that's actually looking like will be 120,000 above budget.
Correct. It's just a timing difference, and there's a slight delay in the distributions from the county.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sure. Any other questions?
The obvious one.
Councilmember White?
Triple flip, can you please define that for us, please?
Absolutely. In March 2004, the state did almost a revenue swapping mechanism whereby they used a quarter of the 1% Bradley Burns sales tax, and they took that to pay revenue bonds, to pay their bonds, and reimbursed the city through property taxes. So there was no net effect to the city. It was just a revenue swapping mechanism, but it changed the timing of when the city would receive revenues. And it just ended in the last fiscal year. Welcome. So moving on to other general fund revenues. In total, these are coming in about $240,000 below budget at 12/31. There's just a few variances I wanted to focus on. Fines and forfeitures are about $200,000 above budget at 12/31. This is due to parking violations. Those payments, we make payments to the courts, which reduce those revenues. Those we only made about 4 at 12/31 versus 6. We also received some credits from overpayments in the prior year. The net of those two items, we believe, will result in about $100,000 positive variance at the end of the fiscal year. The next variance relates to use of money and property. It's coming in about $124,000 below at 12/31. This is almost entirely due to investment income, where interest rates are just below where we had anticipated. And the last, there's two more I wanted to discuss. The next one is intergovernmental is coming in above budget about $180,000. That's due to mutual aid reimbursements for the fire department. The fire department budgeted about $600,000, and as of 12/31 had already received $580,000. And the last one is miscellaneous. I actually have a slide that goes into detail, so I will wait to talk about that. This is the miscellaneous detail. In total, about $424,000 below budget at 12/31. The first one is an actual miscellaneous category. This is almost entirely due to just payment to vendors. It's just a timing difference. An example is an AMR reimbursement to the fire department, but we expect to meet budget by year end. The second one is operating transfer in. This is due to traffic safety citation revenues. They are down for the current fiscal year by about $190,000, and that's due to staffing shortages in this program. And staff does expect to come in under budget by about $140,000. And the last area I will focus on is general fund fees and service charges, coming in about $1 million below budget at 12/31. There are three areas I was focusing on, and that is public works, about $400,000 below budget at 12/31. This is almost entirely due to staff vacancies in billable positions, primarily engineering. Also, $160,000 in-kind general fund contribution for the Cliff Drive Las Positas project, where there's no corresponding revenue. And staff does project this to come in under budget by as much as $900,000 by the end of the year. Next, the library is about $470,000 below budget at 12/31. This is purely a timing difference in the annual county payment. Normally it's received in January, and normally it's received in November. This year it's received in January, so we do expect to meet budget by year end. And last is reimbursements. It's a difference of about $136,000 below budget. This is due to interdepartmental reimbursements that are booked at year end. We see this every year at mid-year, and we expect to meet budget. And that is everything I was going to present, but I'm happy to answer some more questions.
Councilmember Dominguez, you had a question?
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said about the public works number. I apologize.
Public Works is due to staffing vacancies, primarily in the engineering department, which is their billable positions. So related to things such as work orders. And so there's also a corresponding decrease on the expenditure side. So we'll see the revenue impact, but we'll also see the savings on the expenditure side. But we
Okay.
do expect to be, staff expects to be as high as $900,000 below budget by year end.
And going back to the slide before that, you mentioned traffic safety citations were down.
Correct.
And what's the amount that they were down?
About $190,000 below budget, and we expect to be down at the end of the year about $150,000.
So
And
does,
that-
does that
sorry.
also mean that citations are down by a significant amount as well?
I would have to have, I would assume that's the response, but I would probably have to have police respond to that. I'm not sure if we have Lori here, but
And the only reason I'm concerned is I'm not sure about the city's safety statistics, but I know nationwide traffic fatalities and injuries are way up this year. So it would seem like we want to make sure we're doing as much as we can to enforce these rules. And I know we were down significant personnel in the department last year, and I know we're ramping back up. So maybe at a future point, we could hear, oh, someone's walking up now. Maybe the future is here.
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Councilmember Dominguez. Correct. It's a staffing issue and trying to fill in the specialty assignments. We do have a number of officers who will finish up their training in late April, early May. So they'll come on board, and then there's another group in the fall. So I think you'll see us staffing up those enforcement positions with those additional bodies coming online.
Great, thank you.
Please continue.
Good afternoon, Chair Hart, committee members. I'm Jennifer Tomaszewski, the accounting manager for the finance department. And again, I will be going over the general fund expenditures, the enterprise fund revenues and expenditures, and the budget adjustments today as well. So this first slide probably looks very familiar. It's the general fund expenditures, and it's broken out by the different departments. And the next column is the adjusted annual budget. So again, this is original adopted budget, including also including carry forwards from the prior year and any current year appropriation changes throughout the year. And that is about $129.7 million for fiscal year 17. The next column is the year-to-date budget, the year-to-date budget, which is a 3-year average benchmark. And then we have your actual year-to-date. And then in the column that we'll be discussing is the variances without encumbrances. So at mid-year, we have about we're about 2.8 million below budget. So when we look at our year-to-date budget, it's about 66 million versus our actual of about 63.2 for about a $2.8 million savings at mid-year. I'm going to just go through a couple highlights. Administrative services has about a $278,000 savings. About 130 of that is related to staff vacancies in human resources and the city clerk, which I believe city clerk, and both of those have since been filled. But the remaining savings is professional services in elections, which staff anticipate will have the savings at year end. Another area I wanted to point out was police, to kind of piggyback on what we were talking about. Police has about a savings of about 1.8 million at mid-year, and at mid-year there were 12 vacancies. And let's see, there's overtime was about I think about $1 million over budget, $500,000 to $1 million. I need to double check on that, but it was far offset by the savings with the vacancies. Of those vacancies, they're comprised of about 2 officers, 6 dispatchers, 2 parking enforcement officers, 1 animal control officer, and 1 information technology position. And as we stated, the next academy starts in April. Staff still anticipate that the savings by year end will be about 2.4 million. And I think in the narrative it says 2.7. However, after that was written, staff changed the projection for year end. And moving on to fire, in the opposite direction, fire's over budget by about 1.2 million at mid-year. And as in the past, the majority of this is related to mutual aid activities. I think about 800,000 or 900,000 of that's related to mutual aid expenditures beyond budgeted amounts. But we do know that revenues are anticipated to far exceed the mutual aid revenues that will come back are going to be at year end about 400,000 more than the mutual aid expenditures by year end. There is another component to this overage of about 300,000 that's related to staffing. They do have 2 positions that are overfilled. So those overfilled positions are filled, but there's no corresponding budget to those. So the department is they're watching their revenues and expenditures, and as in prior years, they'll come back later with budget adjustments to offset some of these overages. I wasn't going to go into a lot of the other departments, but across the board, it's similar to the last couple years in public works, parks, library, community development. We see a lot of savings from salaries, and that's just continued this year. So one area, the last area I did want to just point out is the non-departmental. This is over budget by about $73,000 at mid-year. Typically, the activity in the non-departmental are one-time transfers, so it's really just a timing difference, and the timing difference is also offset by about $113,000 in appropriated reserves that are programmed. In the last couple years, the appropriated reserves were about $2 million and $2.3 million, whereas this year only $113,000 were appropriated or programmed for fiscal year 17. So again, this is just timing differences. So just again to recap, it's favorable variance about $2.8 million. However, we do have $3.8 million encumbered, so it's a lot of that's just a timing difference. We do anticipate to see probably around anywhere from $2 to $4 million in savings by year end. So any questions before I move on to enterprise funds? So this next slide is a similar format to the last slide. We have the different enterprise funds, and then we have again the annual budget, which again is original adopted budget plus prior year carry forwards and any changes throughout the current year. And again, the year-to-date budget is also a 3-year average, and our actuals, and then our variances. So first I wanted to talk about the water fund. So at mid-year, water revenues are about $1.5 million above year-to-date budget, and about $900,000 of this is due to surplus water sales. And the main reason for this is I think we're in the third year of a 5-year replacement program to replace 24,000 meters, and to date I think about 13,000 of those have been replaced, and that's resulted in higher measured water sales and less system losses as compared to the original rate model. So in addition to that, buy-in and tap fees are about $370,000 higher than the year-to-date budget, and this is due to new development in the Upper State Street area. So even though revenues are high at mid-year, staff are still anticipating that revenues could be approximately $2.5 million below budget by year end. And this is a combination of the recent wet weather in addition to the lawn watering ban that took effect in January. So on the expense side, the water fund is about $4.4 million below budget at mid-year, and this is due to about $1 million in savings due to reduced chemical and landscape costs, as iron media did not need to be replaced as originally anticipated. And there was also about $470,000 in salary savings here as well. I believe there were 10 vacancies in water operations, but the vast majority of the savings is large savings in professional services from the desalination facility, as the plant's not yet online. And again, the staff anticipate that the savings at year end will be about 4.1, which will at least, offset any reduction in revenues that are expected by year end. So next I'm going to go on to the wastewater fund. Wasn't really going to talk about revenues. They're pretty much tracking at budget. They're slightly over, and I believe they're slightly over from sewer buy-in. But the real discussion here is the expenditures are below budget by about $730,000. And this is really a combination of several items. There's also vacancies here as well. Facilities maintenance and equipment repair is below budget by about $340,000. Staff are incorporating several budgeted items into the CIP program for improvements, which is freeing up the operating budget. And in addition, the operations and maintenance engineer has been temporarily reassigned, saving a little over $200,000 for that. And then lastly, waste disposal costs are below budget by about $130,000. This is due to the use of a lighter polymer, which basically reduces waste, which in turn reduces hauling costs. So at year end, staff anticipate that savings could reach 1.5 million. And next, I'm going to talk about the airport fund. And I skipped over downtown parking, but I guess just quickly, revenues are slightly below budget, but they're still tracking. I'm back on downtown parking. The revenues are estimated to be about 55,000 above budget by year end. They changed the hours at the kiosks, opening an hour later and staying open an hour later, and they're anticipating that that's going to be a revenue generator. And on the expense side, you see it's down about 374,000. About 155,000 of that is also salary savings. And then the remainder is special projects, and that's just a timing difference. Staff anticipate spending that by year end and estimate that there'll be about 185,000 in savings at year end for downtown parking. So now I will go back to the airport. So the airport is currently about 390,000 higher than year-to-date budget. The majority of that is a timing difference from a one-time transfer from the Airport Development Fund, and that was for reimbursement of expenses that incurred on 6100 Hollister for the sale of that property. And they did increase their landing fees, so they did have some increases in their non-commercial and commercial aviation revenues, and they do anticipate revenues to be over budget by about 350,000 at year end. And then on the expense side, they're at mid-year, there's about a $561,000 savings at mid-year, and about, again, 228,000 of this is a result of salary savings from vacancies, and the remainder is services and supplies that are encumbered but not yet spent. And at year end, they anticipate this will grow to about 1.1 million in savings at year end, about half due to salary savings, and the remainder just a timing difference. They plan to carry that forward into fiscal year 18. And lastly, I was going to quickly go through the golf fund. So the golf fund at mid-year is about $204,000 below budget, below year-to-date budget for revenues, and about 58,000 of this is due to green fees. So even though compared to last year, green fees are about 3% higher, that's still slightly below budget. So the budget was a little maybe more aggressive than what's actually unfolding. And then the remainder is due to the timing of a loan or transfer from the general fund that won't happen until at year end. So staff estimate that by year end, revenues will be below budget by about 127,000. And on the expense side, we see expenses are below budget by about 300,000. And so again, effective 2017, the city did enter into a contract with a new management company to manage the maintenance and operations of the golf course. The department reimburses them a month after the fact. So when the expenses are incurred, they submit for reimbursement. So there's always a 1 month delay in that. So at mid-year, there were only 5 months of expenses captured in this number. As well, let's see. In addition, there were about 58,000 in savings due to reduced contributions to the general fund for golf staff that were able to be placed into existing positions, and then about 32,000 savings for a vacancy. So again, at year end, the expenses are projected at year end to be about 270,000 below budget. So again, this will offset the reduction in revenue and end in about 144,000 favorable variance. So that's all I had for the enterprise funds. So unless you have any questions, I will move on to the budget adjustments.
Right.
So we have about 6 slides for the budget adjustments. In this first slide, these all relate to the central library. The very first adjustment for $6,800. This is a request to increase appropriations and estimated revenues for damage from a FedEx. I think it was a FedEx truck. It created, it hit the central library book drop, so they're requesting to appropriate the funds for the repairs to the damage and to receive the reimbursement from FedEx. And then all the remaining adjustments you see here, they're to receive and utilize contributions from various organizations for several library programs at the central library. I'm not going to go into those in detail, but they're in your packets. So this next slide, there's two parts to this one. So this first slide has two parts to it as well. So the first $87,000, this is a procedural adjustment, and it's to move remaining unused reserves for capital projects back to the operating funds that originally funded them in the first place. And we're going to see several of those on the upcoming slides. So at year end fiscal year 16, there was about $121,000 in unused reserves within the streets capital fund. So they're asking to transfer $87,000 back to the operating fund, but they're also asking to appropriate $35,000 of those in the streets capital fund. And this is to be used for the Sycamore Creek letter of map revision, which is due to associated work in the floodplain. So when the budgets were prepared, staff were not aware of this it didn't exist yet. So this is a new requirement. Therefore, staff are asking to appropriate the funds for that. And this next group of, do you have a?
Councilmember White?
Sure.
Can we get some information on that letter of map business? Just, I'm sure that our accounting staff is not going to be able to tell us about that, but perhaps we could get just an email on what that's about.
I think
Had
Mr.
a
Demore
brief
is ready to
paragraph.
answer that. So come on up.
Brian Demore, city engineer. So the letter of map revision is required by FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, for any work within the floodplain or floodway. And we've been doing a lot of bridges throughout town, as you're probably aware. And FEMA and the Department of Water Resources came out in 2016 and did what is called a community assistance visit. And they go out and just look for work that has occurred within those areas. And they look at both private and public projects. And they noted some work that had occurred specifically along Sycamore Creek, where we did our bridge on Punta Gorda and some channel improvements. And then there was also the work at the mobile home park adjacent. So they didn't have anything on file for either of those, both the public and the private, and sent us a letter asking us to get things submitted, which would show whether or not the flood map would change. And so we're doing some work with a consultant. We have a proposal from him to move forward so that we can get that information over to FEMA. And I mean, ideally, when we do these improvements, the map changes for the better, and we can get some people out of the map and out of having to pay for the insurance.
And the mobile home park, is that the two-story mobile home park? Is that the one that we're concerned with there?
Yes, that's correct.
And so are they helping to pay for this?
They are doing their own separately.
And the one that we're doing is not covering them, then it's covering the bridge, the consequences of the bridge work and those improvements.
That's correct. We're keeping it separate.
Thank you.
Councilmember Dominguez, you have a question on the same stuff?
Yeah, so $35,000 sounds like a lot for a letter.
Yes, it would be a lot if all they were doing was a letter. I think that's kind of not helpful terminology, what they've come up with. So what the consultant submits is called a conditional letter of map revision, and then when the work is done, you turn in a letter of map revision. In this case, the work's already been done. So we're going to have them just go ahead and do the letter of map revision for the work that's been completed. But we also do have some additional work that's proposed. So there's kind of three phases to this. Letter of map revision for the work that's already been done, and then they will be submitting a conditional letter of map revision for the work that's planned. We've got the Montecito Street Bridge and also Cacique Soledad, those pedestrian bridges. Incidentally, those projects should be out to bid next week, so that's great news there. And so that would be a conditional letter of map revision, then followed finally by a letter of map revision, which would cover everything that's been done. And that work requires extensive analysis of the drainage, and they go and they get cross sections of the channel and model different storm events and come up with depth of water for the 100-year. So there's a lot of analysis, and they need to have the right software that's compatible with FEMA so that when the information's received, it will be acceptable.
Did we do this stuff before we started building and before we started designing?
We haven't done this before because in the past all we had done was what is called a no-rise certification, and we felt like that was sufficient, and FEMA never said anything. It's just been recently that they've alerted us that the no-rise certification from an engineer is not adequate. They need to see the detailed analysis from the consultant who's got the software and can model it. And typically that happens during the design process. It's just it doesn't get packaged up and sent to FEMA. So now we're taking that step, and it will be included in all of the future projects as part of the scope of work for the consultant.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Go right ahead, Ms. Tomaszewski.
Okay, so the second or the last adjustment on this slide are for the county library fund, and again, similar to the last to those on the last slide. These are to receive to receive and utilize contributions from the various organizations for several of the county library fund programs. So for Goleta, Buellton, Solvang, Montecito, and Carpinteria. And again, the details of these are included in your packets. So on this next slide, the first group of adjustments would be for the police grants fund, and there's 3 adjustments here. The first one relating to the memorial statue project. So to honor the 5 officers who lost their lives in the line of duty with the Santa Barbara Police Department, a life-size bronze memorial statue will be constructed, and the statue will be financed entirely through donations and fundraising efforts. So to date, they have received another $8,600. And the second adjustment for $255, this is a cleanup item. Additional donations were received last year, which fell to reserve, so staff request to appropriate those to use for animal control equipment. And then the last adjustment for $3,000, this relates to 911 related training. So the city is eligible to receive an allotment from the state specifically for 911 related training. So that's it for the police grants fund. And this last group of adjustments, again, this is more of those procedural cleanup, have you. Basically, again, these are unused capital funds in the Water Capital Fund and the Water Drought Fund being returned back to the Water Operating Fund. And I thought you might have a question about why the $11 million is so high. So we did look at that, and it's actually a combination of several things that happened. So there was about $3.5 million that was received from the state to the Water Drought Fund for expenses that were actually incurred towards the desalination facility, and those expenses were actually incurred in the operating fund. So we need to transfer transferred those reserves back to the operating fund. There were another $4 million in COMB and CCWA reimbursements, also that were not anticipated, and about $2.7 million from unused groundwater development, or from the groundwater development project, and then another 1.3 million in budgeted desalination appropriations that were later rebudgeted in the SRF fund itself. So when you look at all of those in total, they equal the 11.3 million that we're transferring back to the operating fund. So
Councilmember Dominguez?
What was the $4 million number you gave us?
it's a combination of 3 reimbursements from COMB, CCWA, State Water, and CCWA conveyance. So the combination of those are $4 million. I don't have a lot of details on those.
Thank you, Mr. Hagmark.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, these are all things actually we had identified when we put together our budget, and particularly the rates that were adopted in August. These were all kind of the unknowns, and just to kind of walk through them, COMB was for the barge. Barge cost ended up being a little less. CCWA, those were costs for purchasing water and conveyance of water. We were very fortunate this year and didn't have to buy as much water. We were able to enter into an agreement where the cost of water was substantially less than we had anticipated. So that in net brought back that $4.2 million. And then we also had money in there for groundwater that we did not drill a new well. And so that money came back as well. So that was the best case scenario we were hoping for, and it's starting to come back to that. So it's good.
Thank you for the good news.
Thank you.
Okay, so this next slide, these first 2 adjustments, these are again more cleanup, transferring unused capital reserves back to the operating funds, in this case for wastewater and downtown parking. And the last budget adjustments there's 2 more that relate to the golf fund. And this first one, so what this is, it's at the end of fiscal year 16, about $149,000 in reserves in the fleet replacement fund had been over the years accumulated, and for for the golf fund, and starting fiscal year 17, Parks and Recreation has elected to have the golf fund finance their own vehicle replacements going forward. And so this is a request to have those reserves transferred to the golf fund, and we'll see the other half of this adjustment on the next slide. And the last adjustment, this relates to debt service. And what this is, so the golf fund has 2 general fund loans, the Golf Safety Improvement Loan and the COP Advance. And the principal and interest for the 2 loans were under budgeted in error, so this is a correction to get the principal and interest amounts corrected. It's in total about $128,000, so that they can pay the correct amounts. And this next slide, this one relates to the fuel site upgrade loan. It's a little confusing in that it goes through 3 different funds. And so what this is the Facilities Management Fund has $75,000 in reserves that are designated for upgrades to the fuel distribution and storage system. And currently the fuel upgrade project has begun in the fleet fund. So the facilities, because these reserves relate directly to this project, staff recommend using these reserves to help fund that project. Down in the lower section, you see the Fleet Maintenance Fund and the Fleet Replacement Fund. So this is where it gets a little complicated in that the Fleet Replacement Fund loaned the amount of the project to the Fleet Maintenance Fund. This is why it has to go through the 3 different funds. So it basically it's transferring the fleet operation, or the facilities operating fund that has the reserves, is transferring them to the maintenance fund, which can then reduce their loan to the fleet replacement fund. So it's just a little bit confusing. And this next section, this is again more of that cleanup, moving the unused capital reserves to the operating fund for the facilities operating fund. And then the last two budget adjustments also relate to the fleet replacement fund. So the first one, this is to increase, staff recommend increasing appropriations $90,000, and this is to purchase 3 animal control vehicles that need to be replaced. The current vehicles have inadequate ventilation, and it's causing employees to become ill. And efforts to seal off the passenger area from the cargo area have been unsuccessful. Therefore, the vehicles need to be replaced. And then the last adjustment, this is the other half of transferring the 149 of reserves, 149,000 to the Gulf Fund. So we have one more adjustment, and this relates to the successor agency fund. And the funding for the Lower State Street Sidewalk project was approved by both the Successor Agency Oversight Committee and the State Department of Finance. The project is tied to the La Entrada development and will be completed this fiscal year, and the revenues have already been received through tax increment payments. This adjustment increases the appropriations from the available reserves. So that's it for my budget adjustments. So just to recap, staff recommendations, we ask that you accept the interim financial statements for mid-year and approve the proposed budget adjustments. And that concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Are there any questions? Is there a motion to accept the financial statements and approve the proposed budget adjustments? Is there a second? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed and abstain? Nobody? Thank you very much for that information. Comprehensive report. Next thing on our agenda is options for enhanced abandoned waste collection service. Mr. Four, are you going to take this? Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, Chair, committee members. Matt Four, still serving in my previous capacity as solid waste manager. We're here today in response to a request that Council made back in May of 2016 at our last solid waste fund budget hearing for fiscal year 17. We were directed by Council to go and look at some options for combating the prevalence and sort of the breadth and scope of abandoned waste that we see in the city. So working with Marburg staff, who's here today, Derek Carlson, Marburg's business manager, we've looked pretty intensely over the past several months at some of those options. We're here today to recommend several options for you to consider to be built into services beginning in fiscal year 18, but also the cost of those services to be built into the trash and recycling rates that we charge to city ratepayers beginning in fiscal year 18 as well. So what we'll talk about today is just a bit of background, some observations that we have seen related to abandoned waste since July of 2014 when the new contract with Marburg commenced. We'll go into our recommendations, what it looks like for customer rate adjustments in FY18, and then a couple of enhancements that were brought up by community members, both to me directly, some at the council meeting, and then some through the Neighborhood Advisory Committee, that we are not opting or recommending for implementation at this time, and then finally how this would all bear out if you do agree and concur with staff's recommendation. So just by way of background, as I said, in July of 14, the city entered into this new agreement with Marburg for 10 years. And I think it's helpful to know from where we came as it pertains to abandoned waste prevention and service. And so under this new agreement, we expanded abandoned waste collection citywide. And we used Marburg in previous years serviced up to 1,000 abandoned waste events throughout the city. We doubled that to 2,000. At that time, that would not only cover our current load of abandoned waste, but it actually gave us some breathing room. And so by doing that, on the prevention side, we also expanded bulky waste collection in the residential sector. And single-family residents always received one bulky waste collection every year. We expanded that to 2. We also brought, for the first time, bulky waste collection to multi-unit residential properties. Now, Derek and I went out to and met with 5 or 6 of the largest property management companies in the city as we designed this program to ask them how it should work, what would be the best means to have this happen. And in looking at how other jurisdictions did this and then also talking to our customers, we decided that it would be best to provide this service through the account holder, through the multi-unit property owner or manager, so that they would have control over when and where bulky waste would be collected. You could imagine if you had a 100-unit apartment building, we'd want that coordinated. So what we had envisioned was that a property manager for their property would pick a date, pick a Saturday, work with Marburg to provide a roll-off box or whatever it is in the right-of-way for all of the residents of that apartment building, would then advertise it to its tenants, and then on that one controlled specific Saturday, all of the tenants would take their bulky waste out to a central location that had been pre-planned. So that's the way that we set it up. Now, what have we seen since 2014? So since the new contract went into place, we've noticed 3 things. The first is that the incidence of abandoned waste has increased, and it's increased rather dramatically. Over the past 2 or 2.5 years, we've seen about a 60% increase in the number of abandoned waste sites throughout the city. Anecdotally, we thought that was correct, but now we have the data, and we've gone into the data to bear that out. The second observation is that the system that we have in place to receive abandoned waste reports, it's inefficient, and in many cases, it's leading to delays in Marburg servicing that pile. Now, Marburg has a contractual obligation to collect waste within 72 hours of that report getting to Marburg in a form and format that's actionable, and they always hit that. But there are other external factors that have led to longer delays where waste is sat out on a roadway for longer than 72 hours, and we're aiming to fix that. The third observation is that bulky waste collection alone in the residential sector, even with the expansion that we've put into place, is not an effective means of keeping pace with the abandoned waste that we're seeing. Right? It is a deterrent, it is a preventative measure, but it's not solving our problem. And we'll go into some of our findings related to that. So the first observation, the incidence of abandoned waste has increased, and you can see the numbers. Calendar year 14, we had 1,406 sites reported to us. Calendar year 16, that had increased to 2,281. It's a 62% increase over 2 years. Within that, it's important to note that in response to dwindling streets revenues, the streets department, as they refocused on their core mission of street maintenance and repaving and repair, they pulled back on the amount of abandoned waste collection that the streets division was undertaking. And they did some. This was not equivalent to Marburg's level of service, but there was some level of service provided by the streets department for abandoned waste. And so one of the things that our recommendation will solve then is picking up that some of those incidents that the streets division previously took care of, and we would put that on Marburg's shoulders as we'll lay out in our recommendation today. The second thing to note is that the streets division also took care of some homeless encampment cleanups as well, and they coordinated that with the police department. One of our recommendations will be that we build that into the solid waste rates, so we have a steady funding source moving forward. So in relation to our current abandoned waste reporting system, I said it's inefficient and it leads to delays in servicing. This is how it works. So the streets division their dispatch line, which is in charge of all of the dispatching of streets activities during the day, has also doubled as the abandoned waste intake line for the city. This is a historic legacy system. At the time that it was set up years and years ago, they could probably handle it. Now that they're having to take 2,281 calls in, it just isn't a robust enough system to handle that. So because of that, what happens, the reports come in, Streets forwards those to Marburg. Marburg will dispatch a truck to go pick it up. If the information is correct, it's collected within 72 hours. What we're finding is if the information's incorrect, if it's East Anapamu, not West Anapamu, if it's some address, but actually it's the alleyway behind that address, then Marburg drives all over creation looking for these things, or goes back to the office, has to track down the RP, which many times on a voicemail system is not easy to do, or there's no contact information. So it leads to delays. And that's something that we've heard from the community and we're looking to address. The third observation through 2014, as I said, is that bulky waste collection on its own is insufficient to curb abandoned waste. One of the things that we did last summer, Marburg and the city, is Derek and I went back out again to the same 5 property management companies and said, we've had this service in place for a couple years. How's it working? Is there anything we can do to improve it? Are there obstacles to you using it? And based upon what they said and some other insights, the Environmental Services Division developed and implemented a multi-pronged outreach campaign specific to multi-unit property owners and tenants to make them aware of this service to try to increase the use. We wanted greater participation in this service that the clients are already paying for in their trash and recycling bills. So between August and November, we hit it pretty hard. And what we found is we were able to achieve a gain in the single-family residential sector of 25%. We saw a 25% increase in the number of single-family residential customers that used this service. It was pretty good. We also saw an increase in the multi-unit residential sector of 18%. But overall, if we look at even with those increases, overall, in the residential sector as a whole, we're still only seeing an overall participation rate of 20% sector-wide. Now that's pretty consistent with other jurisdictions when we've called around and asked about this. It's 20%. It's serving as a preventative means, because if we can bring a truck to somebody's curb, it's less likely that those big bulky items like couches, refrigerators, mattresses will end up on the curbside or as abandoned waste. But through our concerted effort, we were able to get participation to 20%, and yet we're seeing a 62% increase in abandoned waste. They're not keeping pace with each other. But we tried. We tried to make it happen.
Councilmember Dominguez?
So let me make sure I understand these stats. So 20% sector-wide total participation. Are you saying 80% of people don't use this channel? So they're either dumping or they're taking it themselves?
That's correct.
And then the 62% number, what does that mean? I mean, in my mind, that means there's 62% more waste being generated in the city?
Well, we don't know the origin necessarily, but what we've seen is the number of abandoned waste piles have increased 62% annually. So if we take 12 months of abandoned waste incidents between 2014 and 2016, that number has increased by 62%.
So are there channels that we no longer have? Are people no longer driving trucks full of stuff to different dump-off points? Or
all of the permitted facilities that we had in 2014 are still available. The only variable that we know of is the reduction in streets division service. But we don't really know exactly how many piles they were cleaning up, and it was not a full-fledged service like we had Marburg. They were doing some level, but the city's main means of collecting abandoned waste was through Marburg. So to the extent that there are some piles out there that the streets division used to service, we would like to put that on Marburg and have them augment that service level.
Could be that people find it effective to leave stuff on the curb because we pick more of it up. And so it makes
Could
sense
be.
for them to do that,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
So with that, based upon those findings, we're bringing to you a couple of recommendations. The first is that we transfer the reporting responsibilities from the Streets Division dispatch line to Marburg. Based upon this additional volume of calls and the time that the Streets Division would spend tracking down reporting parties and getting actionable information, we can do that, and Marburg can handle that with an enhancement of about $10,000 to their customer service center. What we get in return for that is a fully staffed customer service center that's open, and somebody will talk to a live person during all business hours, Monday through Saturday. They will also have bilingual customer service reps, which has proven to be an obstacle with our streets dispatch line. And Marburg CSRs are particularly adept and trained at soliciting detail. They know the questions to ask to get accurate locations so that when they cut the service order, Marburg drivers know exactly where to go and pick this up. So we think that should happen hopefully sooner than later, or even immediately. The second recommendation is that we increase abandoned waste collection events from our current 2,000 to 2,500. That will bring us once again up to what we're seeing now. We had 2281 in 2016. It'll give us a little bit of a buffer, but at least it will bring us to where we are today. And that cost would be $33,700. And then the final recommendation is that we generate about $20,000 through the trash and recycling rates to ensure that our historic level of homeless encampment cleanup continues. So historically, we've done anywhere between 25 and 35 homeless encampment cleanups a year. It's one of the P3 objectives for the police department. We are proposing to generate $20,000. The average cost per homeless encampment cleanup in the last year was $880. So rounding it up to $1,000 to account for the higher tipping fees at Tahigas and things. We think that's just a prudent move, again, just to keep keep service levels in this arena to what they have historically been. And then lastly, the fourth recommendation is to grant the finance director change order authority of up to $30,000 a year to augment abandoned waste services wherever they might be needed. So for example, it could be that if we go to 2,501 abandoned waste events, we can pay for that additional increment if we so choose. It could be additional homeless encampment cleanups if we go above the 20 that we're estimating that this would cover. It could be that we dispatch a flatbed truck and a crew from Marburg to particular hotspot areas around the city just to get them under control. We're not waiting for calls to come in. We know that this area, we just need to get a handle on it. We might dispatch a truck for a couple of days, and this would give the finance director the authority to do that just to keep pace. So all told, the total cost of these four recommendations is $93,750. As it relates to customer rates, that equates to a 0.45% rate increase on all city trash and recycling services. For the traditional single-family residential customer, it would be a 16-cent per month increase. And we wanted to recommend this incremental approach, just being sensitive to the other utility rate increases that are being proposed in FY18. So ours, this $93,000 would be 16 cents a month on the average household. We think it's prudent. We think it's a good incremental approach, and we think we can dramatically knock down some of these pervasive problems. So those are the recommendations that we are bringing to you today. There were a couple of other things that other groups had provided to us or suggested to us as part of this investigation. The primary one was from the West Side Neighborhood Association, and they had asked us and asked council at the budget hearing last year, could the city entertain putting a rebate on abandoned mattresses. So, for example, on the west side where we see mattresses everywhere, could we put a $15 or $20 rebate on those to essentially hire a diffuse workforce of residents to bring those in? Well, currently, and this is as of last year, Marburg, under the Mattress Recycling Council Extended Producer Responsibility legislation, they became a collection point for that program, for the product stewardship mattress legislation. So now, when those mattresses come in, when people bring those to the Marburg yard, Marburg used to charge $10 a mattress. Because of their enrollment in this MRC program, they've been able to drop that fee to $0. And they're able to handle the number of mattresses that come in. And realize they're the collection point for not only the city of Santa Barbara, but also the south coast portions of the unincorporated county and Goleta. So for our benefit, they collected about almost 4,000 mattresses last year. In total, they've taken in 10 to 12,000 as a region, serving all their customers. So we talked to Marburg about that, and we said, do you have any more capacity? If we were to offer this rebate, could you handle it? And they said, no. We can handle you bought a new mattress and you want to swap yours out, we can handle that. To open the floodgates to start paying people to bring them in, they said, we can't safely take those. We don't have any more room. We have a lot of dangerous stuff here going on in our yard, and we couldn't accommodate that. So at this point, we're not recommending that we move forward with that recommendation. So in terms of the next steps, sure.
Councilmember White?
I mean, so we have a problem here that we're saying, well, we can't handle it. That seems like a tough place to, okay, let's stop on that one and move on. That doesn't feel like a...
Well, I'm sorry. Let me give you what our recommendation is. So Marburg is 1 yard in the city, right? For that 1 yard to take another 10,000 mattresses, say, they would be overrun. There are plenty of solid waste facilities or potential collection points. What we would recommend, and what we've already brought to the local task force, this collection of jurisdictions that talk about regional solid waste planning, we think this should be done at the regional level, where the county's facilities are available, the transfer station, with other potential collection points where we're all doing this together, so that we're spreading this number of mattresses out over a larger geographic region and not just being dependent on Marburg's one facility to take everything that could come in. Because realize, if we don't do this as a region, once the city of Santa Barbara offers a rebate, you may very well have mattresses from Goleta, from Nolita, from other jurisdictions coming in because we're the ones paying. Mm-hmm. If we do this uniformly, we think that's the better way to go, just as it pertains to mattresses. So,
Councilmember Dominguez?
So before you get into the timeline, I just
Sure.
want to go into some of the details a little more. So one, I'm obviously very much in favor of some changes. I've emailed you and talked to you a few times about details, particularly with my area, the district, downtown district, and the east side. There's a lot of mattresses and bulky items. The concerns I have is that we're going to raise people's rates, and this is because we're not getting the people who are generating the waste to pay for it themselves, so we're spreading out the burden, and that to me is the second choice. The first choice would be to narrow down where we're collecting money to the people who are generating the waste, and it sounds like you've talked to some of the large apartment owners. The problem I see and that I saw earlier is they're only getting 1 or 2 pickups a year, whether there are 8 units or 100 units. So it seems expected that people are going to just put stuff out on the street. And from what I understood as well, correct me if I'm wrong, the tenants themselves aren't calling for pickups. It's the owners or the property managers who have to call. So there's another level of bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. You gave us this blue arrow that has different steps, but for the apartment buildings, there's actually an initial step that's not listed where the apartment dweller has to call the property manager. And there could even be a breakdown there, and there's probably is if they're leaving not of their own accord. So I'd love to see a tightening of the nexus between who's generating the trash and who's paying for it. Is there something we looked at to do that?
Well, let me answer this in two parts. The first is that we looked, and the staff report goes into greater detail about opening the potential of opening bulky waste collection to tenants directly. What this recommendation here is today is what we're recommending that we know we can put into place right now. And part of what is driving this is the calendar that we go by in order to set rates for each fiscal year. And so the things that the city and Marburg have successfully been able to negotiate costs and processes for are represented in these recommendations. What we haven't been able to work out yet is the system by which we would open this to tenants directly, because both the city's utility billing system and Marburg's billing system are set up for account level transactions. It's the account holder. Now, they've been talking to their software developers, they've been talking to their system engineers about, could we make some changes to offer this to tenants? We just don't have that system in place yet. They can't definitively tell us, yes, we can. It doesn't mean that at some point we can't. It doesn't even mean that at some point in mid-year of FY18, we couldn't make this change. We'd have to do the noticing like we're doing, but we can't. We don't want to start collecting fees on something that we don't know we can make it work. But since December, when you first brought this up at the work session, we've been diving into the possibility of making that happen. We just haven't gotten there yet. And so there are some logistical challenges to offering it to tenants and being able to track who in a particular multi-unit property has called this in, how many times, what's the aggregate. And so we're busy doing that. What Marburg was able to do is to say, look, assume we have the system in place. This is an estimate of the cost that it would take. And so working with the Community Development Department, looking at the number of tenant dwelling units in the city, assuming the same levels of participation rate for those tenants as we see in single family, the cost would be about $330,000 as a ballpark. And if you want to direct us to continue to work on a system that might open the door to tenants, we'd be glad to do that. We just don't have that right here today in order to conclusively say that we can start that in FY18.
So what I'm talking about is something simpler where we just have an increase in the number of pickups based on the number of units in the building.
We could look at that. Yeah. I
mean, I'm assuming trash generation is pretty linear per household.
Here's my only caution to that, and I'll just give you my opinion, but you can take it or leave it, is the first question we tried to answer was, can we get multi-unit property owners to use the service? And we poured 6 months of effort into trying to get them to use the service, and we only got overall sector participation to 20%. So if we make the number of pickups proportional to the number of dwelling units, we're going to build those costs into the rates whether or not the customer uses it. And I don't want to pay for services or charge our ratepayers, whomever they are, for services we haven't been successful at getting people to use.
Well, that's exactly what this model's doing now. It's incrementally sharing it around the city versus if you make a 10-unit apartment manager aware, we're going to charge you for 10 pickups this year whether you use them or not. It certainly creates a stronger incentive that they know when Unit 3 is moving out. Hey, you're moving out on January 17th. We're going to have a bulky pickup on January 16th. And part of you getting your deposit back is you actually utilizing that because we're paying for that service, darn it. So,
well, that would take us some time. We'd have to go get a list of all of the multi-unit properties and their number of number of dwelling units and things like that. It doesn't mean it's not impossible, but I would have to request quite a bit more time to look into the feasibility of that.
mm-hmm.
Mr. Samario.
Yes, just wanted to jump into this. I'm not sure how we could charge an apartment complex for services that we're not even sure they're at fault for. You have to establish a connection between how much waste
What do
is
you mean
being
by
abandoned.
fault? Fault.
Well, what I'm saying is if there's abandoned waste on a street, you have to make an assumption and create a strong nexus, an argument that that particular building is what's causing that abandoned
We're
waste.
talking about an enforcement action?
Yeah, I mean, because
Okay, I wasn't talking about enforcement
well,
action.
no, but if you're trying to establish rates of that says you're going to pay for this whether you use it or not, the argument is that they're the ones that are really causing this abandoned waste, and I'm not sure we can prove that.
Well, I have a baseline that if you have 8 units in your building, you probably need 8 times as much pickup as someone who has 1 unit. Is that a fair?
Yeah, but we're talking
assumption?
Yeah, I think Committee Member Domingo, I think we're talking 2 different things. So
Right.
a larger complex is by definition is going to have more services, and they build that into the rates. So they have larger dumpsters for recurring pickups. What we're talking about is who is responsible and how do we allocate the cost for the abandoned waste that we have no idea where that comes from. So the
Well, we're
idea,
guessing proportionally it's coming from apartment buildings
yeah, and that's why
single-family dwellers,
Right.
kind of based on the number of people who live in those units.
right, and that's why our proposal would be to spread those costs across across the board. But the idea to charge more to multi-unit on a presumption that they use more services through the abandoned waste sort of direction is, I'm not sure we can make that presumption.
It's not on the abandoned waste, it's on bulky items. I'm assuming that every household produces the same number of bulky items that need to be picked up over their lifespan.
And then maybe I misunderstood. So on the bulky item pickup, so I think part of what Matt was saying is that if right now there isn't the utilization of bulky item pickups, we could say.
Right, because they don't have to pay for it. So
Right.
why would they use something that they're not paying for? It's an extra administrative burden for them to have to call Marburg and set it up, or call the city at this point to set it up. It's a burden for them to have to talk to the tenant
Right.
and give them their deposit back. I mean, there's a lot of
course.
administrative
Sure.
things going on when someone moves out of an apartment building.
I
That
agree.
there's an incentive to not have to deal with that if there's
Right.
no cost to you as the administrator.
So again, the idea then would be to charge them for higher number of, so for example, we'll say we're going to offer 10 bulky item pickups per year and charge you accordingly for that. If we still see no participation, then they're paying for services they're not getting. They're not
That's
utilizing.
still more fair than this system where you're charging everyone in the system,
Right.
even though they're not the ones who are requesting bulky items or have bulky item pickups.
Yeah, I just think it'd be a tougher thing to impose a specific charge to complexes on the assumption that we're going to offer you these more services, and even though we know you're not going to utilize them, you're going to be charged for those.
Why don't you think they're going to utilize them?
Because we've seen that evidence of that they're not utilized.
So those are free riders. If over time you own an apartment building with 8 units and you're not calling for bulky item pickup,
Right.
it's because you're free riding. You're counting on other taxpayers to pay your bills over
Yeah.
time. Again, in the short term, if you're looking at this month, it's not true. But if you own a 50-unit dwelling in Santa Barbara and you're only calling for pickup once a year, and because you're not paying for more than that, and your neighbor has a 4-unit building and they're calling once a year, everyone else is paying for that 50-unit apartment owner's trash to be picked up.
Right.
Right? Does that?
We have to look into it. I guess I'm not sure I agree with that logic.
Councilmember White, I think you had a question as
Well,
well.
I'm not following that logic, because the 50-unit owner can call for a pickup for free.
Once or twice?
Twice
No.
a year.
Twice. Okay, so and if they're not doing that, then, if they're not doing that, then they are paying for a service that they're not getting, right?
Correct.
Okay, so I just feel like, I guess they can't, if they did order their 2 and they're not ordering a 3rd because they'd have to pay for that. That would be where we'd be. That would be the kind of problem where we'd be trying to find a way to get them to use it more. But they're not even using the ones of the 2 that they're allotted for free, quote unquote free, as part of the total cost of the system. So I just am not seeing the logic of what you're saying vis-a-vis the situation where they're underusing something that is already paid for.
So you're saying you think there's 50-unit buildings who aren't using their 2 pickups?
Yeah.
Something like this, or the 7-unit building or whatever. I just feel that that's what staff is saying, is that there are 20% of the buildings are using them, and we don't know whether that's using them once or using them twice. So you could probably, what's the number? We have 1,000 multi-unit buildings, and there are 200, or there'd be 400 pickups if we could go 20%. So we're not getting there even for services that that are quote unquote free, that are no additional cost.
I guess just to
Trying to
repeat,
get at that. I mean, that's what you're trying to attack it and find ways to get accountability and get the work done. And I agree with those goals. I don't think that. I think we're still missing something in this.
and I'm just not sure it makes sense to pay Marburg for more services that are not going to be utilized, to add more bulky item pickups and pay them for that, and the ratepayers are going to pay for that when they're not going to be utilized.
I'm not sure I'm not sure what you're saying.
Well, so again, if they're not, there are 2 offered today. If we offered 10 per year, that I don't think they're going to be utilized. They will be utilized at the same rate, so they won't be as utilized as we think or hope. But we're going to pay for those services, even whether they're utilized or not. So Marburg will have to add to the ratepayers an amount of money to cover the extra bulky item pickups we're going to offer, but they won't be utilized, in our opinion, because they're not being utilized now.
Right, so whenever we create a contract with a vendor, we run the risk of overpaying or underpaying. If we say we want you to pick up 2,000 items and only 800 items are generated, we predicted poorly and we pay a little extra. If they end up picking up 2,200 items and we contracted for 2,000, then we get the benefit of the contract. So we can't ever expect to have a perfect matching between the prediction and what we're picking up. But if we know here that there's 2,000 to 2,500 annually at $33,000, we divide that amongst single-family homes and apartments more evenly than every home gets 1 and every apartment building gets 2. I mean, we can just do a little better calculation than we are today. But if you think it's easier to go with a more elegant but less accurate formula and have everyone just split the burden evenly amongst the city, regardless of whether you're an apartment building that isn't paying the same amount, I mean, that's a different route. I'm not saying one is exponentially better or going to solve the city's budget problems, but in terms of fairness, making bigger apartment buildings pay a little more makes sense to me, but I can see other points of views too.
Is there a time urgency to this? Is this trying to line up with the rate increases for the upcoming budget cycle?
We're here today in advance of the Proposition 218 notice that the city sends out in early April, first week in April. So if you concur, if you would like us to build any or all of these recommendations into the rates, we would do that this month. Mm-hmm. We would then put those into the Prop 218 notice that would go to customers in April. We would then bring this as part of this whole inclusion as part of the Solid Waste Fund budget meeting with council in May. And then ultimately it would be adopted as part of the fee resolution in June. So that's sort of the timeline. Those rates would then go into effect in July.
Well, the staff proposal increases benefits and gives more service. It just doesn't go, I think, as far as Councilmember Dominguez is hoping to go. So that's a question for the committee.
Well, Mr. Chair, well, first of all, and I appreciate that we got brought back around to why are we here? Why are we doing this now? And that we need to have, this is and Mr. Dominguez said this too, it's another imperfect, it's another forecast and another attempt to wrestle with one moving target, which is the waste that's ending up on the street. We don't know the genesis of so many. And that's another topic of conversation. I think that Mr. Dominguez has brought up a good point about the big apartment buildings. How do we get them more actively involved? And I think to put that on staff to say this doesn't feel quite right yet. Although I'm certainly supportive of moving forward. We know every year we're going to be moving forward with an imperfect system and trying to make it a little better. I really appreciate the things that you're talking about here, the pickups, and in particular the homeless encampments that we're not. I was contemplating that the other day as I walked around the bird refuge, and it's kind of a village along there, and you can just hear folks in bush A, B, and C there. So I appreciate that there's a highlight of the homeless encampment cleanups as part of the deal here. So I would hope what we would do is move forward with this, but definitely keep coming back to staff with, we're not there yet on the big buildings, and that the 2 per year doesn't feel quite right. What other ideas are there that you could get creative about for the next round? So maybe that could be a way to move forward with this, Mr. Chair.
Does anybody have a motion?
Can I ask another question?
Councilmember Dominguez?
Do we know, I've mentioned a couple times that this system that Fresno uses, Fresgo, where it's an automated smartphone app. Have we thought of any technology we might want to leverage our ability to streamline the awareness of the abandoned waste process?
Councilman Dominguez, there are a couple of items as part of the, I know there are 2 routes that we've been looking at, a customer or citizen response portal. The first is just through the city's website, Civica, of having an ability for customers to have a mobile platform to do that. The second was through the Acela project, and that's the land use building application project that the information technology is working with community development to put into place. I know that was one of the capabilities that we had asked for. I haven't been intimately involved in that, but I know that was one of the capabilities that was part of the list of recommendations that we had put through, and I thought that there was some promise in that. So I can certainly report back to you on that. I don't know off the top of my head, but those are 2 platforms that we were looking to see if there could be a direct portal for customers to make us aware of abandoned waste.
And I guess I'm kind of proceeding with this assumption, so let me just vocalize it and tell me if it's true. So really how people report it, when they report it, doesn't make a difference in terms of the cost of picking it up. Whether they don't report it, it gets dumped, and we pick it up a week later. The only difference really is we just have trash sitting out on the street longer. Is that kind of a fair understanding?
That's correct. The only variable that really makes a difference in the cost is whether it's ad hoc or scheduled. To the extent that Marburg can schedule the pickup, that's certainly more efficient and more cost effective than just having a roving vehicle looking around and picking up as we see it.
Okay. And I like the idea of having their customer service center do it if that's going to be something that they're focused on and specialized on. Again, I think you talked about how it makes more sense because this is their job, and so they are very specialized in it. So I definitely like that part of the first recommendation. Regarding the $20,000 annually for homeless encampment cleanup, did you say that's $881 per pickup?
So what I said is that the average cost last year of these encampments was $880. I rounded it up to $1,000 because it's an easier number, but also we know the tipping fees are increasing at Tahigas through the Resource Recovery Project just to account for those tipping fee increases and some CPI.
So who are we using for this? Is this Marburg as well?
We haven't made that decision yet. This would generate the funds, and whether we do an RFP process that Marburg would participate in or have a third-party contractor, we have a number of options. This would just provide the funding source.
Okay, thank you.
So, Mr. Chair, I'm ready to make a motion. It's a little more. We can go to the minutes. To the agenda, which talks about providing direction on whether to include the enhanced abandoned waste collection service, and I support that. The particulars are there's the transfer, the reporting responsibilities to Marburg, the increase from 2,000 to 2,500 events annually, change order authority of $30,000 to the finance director. I'm not getting that quite to $93,000, but anyway, are those it?
change order authority, the abandoned waste collection, and the homeless encampments.
Oh, I forgot about the homeless encampments and the homeless encampments. So that's my motion, Mr. Chair.
Okay, is there a second for the motion? I'll second the motion. Isn't there some flexibility in the increase the abandoned waste collection events from 2,000 to 2,500 to how those would be allocated subsequent to making this decision to contract with Marburg for that additional service? Can't there be ongoing conversation about how you'd allocate those extra 500 pickups? Couldn't that follow up on Councilmember Dominguez's conversation about trying to see about the scale of the large, the data collection that you're going to do to find out about the number of large multi-unit apartment buildings and what that might look like as a universe? Couldn't you potentially allocate more of those 500 to those units, or is that?
Well, the one clarification is this is not abandoned waste on private property. It's in the public right-of-way. So we could look at, well, is it near?
So you feel like you need that as it is just to meet the demand that exists today? Yeah.
They're sort of
Except that the
apples
demand
and
is
oranges,
created
Mr.
by,
Chair.
well, it is and it isn't, because they're coming from someplace. And that's my point, is that actually one thing I think I'd like to add to the conversation is that we're creating a system that incentivizes people to do this. And we need to also, at the same time, because we can't have it just sitting out there, but we need to have some conversation about how we would find out who's doing this and penalize them for doing it. So I'd like staff to think some more about that as well. There needs to be some kind of enforcement that actually gets after folks who are improperly putting their stuff out on the curb. And I know that's hard to do because of the nexus issues and trying to find it out, but we need to at least start thinking about it, because we really are adding to the problem over time by being more effective at resolving it, because people rationally decide, oh, well, this is the way I take care of my waste now, is I just leave it out on the curb and somebody else comes and takes it away from me. So,
I think I agree with you, Mr. Chair, on that, as well as I agree with Mr. Dominguez's point of concern, which is that the big the apartment buildings are not marrying up to their waste in some way, and that this would be a topic for staff to just drill down on and come up with suggestions on how to improve it next year or in the future.
And that's why I think we kind of we describe this as an incremental approach, but this will be evolving, and we're going to try to tighten things up to make sure people are held accountable or being charged for the services they receive and not for what they don't receive.
And the accountability spreading back to the dumps on the side of the street, which obviously are enraging, and be nice to catch some of those scafflaws from time to time.
Councilmember Dominguez?
Thank you. How does the billing actually work in terms of the apartment buildings and the bulky item pickups versus just a per capita rate or a per unit rate?
I don't think I understood the question.
Is there a line item for bulky item versus trash and recycling, or is it just $50 per unit, or how does the bill generate?
Well, we built, as part of the contract negotiation, we had a line item for how much it would cost, and we tracked how close we were. We were pretty close on the cost of providing bulky waste collection in general. So it's just built into the compensation that Marburg is paid, on an annual basis. We're not there because there's no additional incremental out-of-pocket cost for the account holder. They're paying for this service when they remit their monthly bill to the city, whether or not they're using it. And so that portion of the service cost that's already embedded in the overall compensation to Marburg is just remitted to Marburg.
So that didn't really answer my question. I was speaking specifically to the bill that the user gets.
The user does not get a bill.
So
The apartment owner doesn't get a bill?
They don't.
So let me just, if I can just, in the bill, when we establish rates, the cost for bulky item pickups across the city is built into everybody's rates. So it's just one layer that's on there.
Well,
So
who
it's-
gets the bill?
Everybody, all the ratepayers pay some
The
portion.
apartment owner gets the bill, not the tenant.
The property owner or the manager gets
Yeah.
the bill.
Okay,
The account holders, yes,
which is the apartment owner.
right.
Yeah.
So they do get a bill.
They get a bill for trash and recycling service for the containers that they subscribe to.
Okay.
There's not a line item for bulky waste collection.
Okay, and that's what I wanted to find out. So it's
Okay.
not broken out.
No.
So they get a bill that says X, and what would it be, for example, for a 4-unit complex?
I don't know. I'd have to get back to you on that.
So let's say it's $200. So they call twice for a bulky item pickup, and then the third time they call, what happens?
they don't get service. The only thing that we provide for in the contract is the two.
They, Mr.
But
Chair.
what happens when the
they
owner
would
says,
charged,
okay. So they can get a third pickup,
yeah, right? Right, Derek?
and they'd be billed separately for that third one. So to me, that's the disincentive for people to use our system. They have to call the manager. The manager might have to get it approved by the owner or not. And then they call Marburg, and Marburg says, great, we'll be there Monday. By the way, it's going to cost how much for that third?
$50.
Do you happen to know off the top of your head? $65. Okay. And so then they go back and tell the tenant, well, it's going to be $65. We're going to add it to your bill, or whatever happens, and and millions of different possible variations. And so then it ends up getting dumped on the curb. This does nothing to address that phenomenon. And I don't know, sometimes I feel like maybe I'm living in a different reality that people aren't understanding how this plays out.
Yeah, I
And
think in
again,
most-
it sounds like what we're saying is people are going to end up paying for it one way or another, and it gets picked up one way or another. But rather than having the system we want, where people call in ahead of time and it gets picked up, the $65 then gets just spread around amongst a bunch of people, which is fine because it ends up pennies on the dollar. But then it sits out there for an extra 3 or 4 days. So it's actually less of an elegant solution because we're not incentivizing people to call in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the only thing I would say, the more likely scenario, though, than what you just described is that the landlord doesn't call at all, doesn't arrange for any of the 2 pickups that they can get for free. So that issue of the third pickup is never even come into the consideration because they're not even taking advantage of the free service that they would not impose on their tenants. They're not even calling that first or second time. So I think that's more
And I
likely
bet, if
scenario.
we have 1,000 of these units or 1,000 property owners, there's probably a third that are really diligent, who follow the letter of the law, and they're out there every day sweeping and cleaning up. And then you have a third that are somewhere in the middle, and then you have a third that are scofflaws, right? Like we just had a huge lawsuit against someone who owns multiple properties, and that's probably someone who falls into the less optimal behavioral category. And so we're really just trying to nudge as a government agency. We're trying to nudge people into behaving properly. And we've created a nudge to not behave properly. We've created a financial incentive to not follow the law, to not follow the rules, to not abide by your contract and our contract with our vendor. And to me, it's a fundamental flaw when we've created an incentive for people to not follow the rules. And that's why we have a 62% increase between 2014 and 16. A large part of that, I can't obviously say all of that, but we've created a huge incentive for both apartment owners and tenants to just dump stuff on the street. And to me,
So do you have another alternative proposal?
Well, I think one thing that would nuance that is to create, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a one extra pickup per unit. I'm not saying for a 50-unit building we need 50 pickups. Again, you pointed out, I think, Councilmember White, they have bigger bins, and there's other things that maybe proportionally reduce it, but maybe for 10 units they have 3, for 20 units they have 5. There's got to be a way to scale it up somewhat proportionally to create an incentive for people to do the right thing.
So do you have another motion?
I would ask that you make a friendly amendment to the motion. And let's see, which one of these 4 staff recommendations would it fit? There's nothing really in here that changes, because this would then be a change. Would it be a change in the billing, or just a change in our policy that's stated on the website in terms of how many we would actually probably have to
It would be a contract amendment
okay.
and an ordinance by council.
Okay.
And, Mr. Chair, if I may, I would suggest that those are pieces, changes, moving the boat, moving the ship in out of sync with our budgeting process. That would be a scramble to get that to happen in this time frame. We have to notice this for Prop 218. I think you're onto some things with the varying the quantity of free pickups, conceivably even a line item on everybody's bill that says that, as we do with some of our other activities, where there's you get your telephone bill and there's 4 or 5 things listed on there of taxes and the 7 cents for hearing impaired and such, that putting that on there may be a good thing to do. So as bulky items is costing you $7.12, and by the way, you have 5 of them a year if you're a 10-unit building or whatever. I think those are pieces that could be put together into a truer incentivized, a more appropriately incentivized system. I don't think it's going to happen in this budget cycle. So I would submit that we try this. I would not try it, but move forward with this. Provide direction to staff on the items that you're talking about. I think those are good ideas, and have them come back with some suggestions. Maybe go to the Rental Property Association, talk it up with them to get buy-in from the owners. That's another piece of the puzzle that's going to be helpful. And then make a change, move the ship in a better direction on the next cycle.
And that all makes sense to me. And I realize we're also running out of time.
I was just going to say that too. Thank you.
So, and let me seek clarity here on in terms of the budget timeline and then Prop 218. So the budget timeline, you want to have this ready for the department so that when it comes back to us for budget hearings, it's kind of wrapped up? Is that kind of the time pressure that you're...
It's the Prop 218 notice that's the time pressure. So we send that out the first week in April. We're coming to...
Do we have to do it in April?
To be ready by July 1st.
To be ready for the June 12th-ish Prop 218 hearing, yes.
But it also, you can make a change mid-year too if you wanted to. This is just
Yeah.
to tee it up on the regular cycle, and this is an improvement that what we have on the table that everybody I think recognizes and agrees. So there's additional interest in continuing this conversation and moving the ball forward down the field as we go on in the fiscal year. But given the time constraints, we have another item on the agenda. I think we need to call the question and have a vote on this item, and then we can have additional conversations about this, and Councilmember Dominguez can meet with staff and talk through some of these issues.
Would I have the patience of my council members to push this back a week?
I don't think we need to. I think, are you opposed to anything that we're doing here?
I don't
want
want
more.
I want a recommendation number 5 that it deals with what I was mentioning, and I think, and I don't know
I
if
think
it's-
there's a lot of work to be done to figure that out. You don't have a
Because
recommendation 5 right now.
My recommendation is that you spread the site pickups proportionally amongst this, based on the size of the apartments. And I don't know if that would even affect the revenue, the $93,000, because really,
let me take the privilege of the chair. We have a motion on the floor. I've heard your comments. We don't have enough time to do this. We have another item on the agenda, so we're going to just have to have a vote on this motion. So all those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Okay. And staff, I think, heard the conversation and direction from Councilmember Dominguez. I'm sure he's going to talk to you about these ideas, and there will be an opportunity to have them integrated in the conversation, just not right now, right today. So with that, this item is finished. We have one more item on the agenda, which is the termination of Article 15A, Fire and Police Service Retirement Plan.
So I'm going to go very quick. I am going to be presenting this with full council today, so I don't have to go into all the details. I can just be quick here. We can spend more time with it at council. But real quick background, as you may know, we have a retirement plan that's been around since the 1920s. It was basically it was closed to new participants back in the 60s when the city shifted to CalPERS. At that time, those employees that were in that old plan had the option to either roll into the CalPERS program or not, and there were a number who decided they wanted to stay with the existing plan under Article 15A for our city charter. It is governed by a Board of Commissioners. We meet quarterly and sometimes semi-annually primarily to talk about investment performance. Today, there are 2 pensioners that are remaining. Each of them has a spouse that would continue to receive benefits if they preceded their spouses. The plan currently has $420,000 in it. We just had a recent evaluation done, an actual evaluation done that showed that we're about $129,000 underfunded. And this takes into consideration that since we did this plan, one of the 3 pensioners passed away. So it was 3 when the plan was evaluated. Now there are 2. So on a net basis, it's a $129,000 shortfall. We in the past have had the plan assets managed by an outside investment manager, and they were guided by what were the investment policies at the time. And in our understanding was that they were governed under a section of state law that was different than what we had to abide by in terms of investing our own city funds. They can invest more aggressively in things like equities and theoretically real estate, just like things that the CalPERS could invest in that we cannot. And the whole purpose of that is because they want to be more aggressive because their focus is different. It's not on safety like we are, but its focus is on generating enough return to pay the benefits, to not put the burden on the employer, for example. Where we invest our monies, our primary focus is on safety. The yield is sort of last. It's safety, liquidity, then yield. So we typically are looking at, today, less than 2% yield on our investments. So this is important because our city attorney's office just opined that the investments in that plan because of the change in state law, are no longer appropriate, that we would need to divest ourselves of those assets, those securities, and invest them in the kinds of things we're allowed to, which are a lot more safe, but are yielding much less return. So because of that, we will have to liquidate, reinvest, and then we're going to be generating, like I said, a lower yield, which means that the unfunded liability in that plan will go up. It's sort of similar to what the PERS just did by lowering the discount rate. If we're investing in 2% paper versus 4% securities, then it's going to, the unfunded liability is going to grow. We're not essentially going to have enough money to cover the pension benefits that are under the obligations of the city. All right, so let's see if I can get to the next one. So if you look at the city charter, it seems pretty clear that the city is responsible to make up any shortfalls. And you may recall back in 2010, they had about a $500,000 shortfall. For those of you who were here, where the general fund contributed a $500,000 to short up. That was because of the losses during the 2008-9 recession. And we have given CPI increases over the last couple of years of 10% in each of those years. But because of what we're at today, the future CPIs are going to be uncertain. But so, given the fact that the state change in state law, and that we're going to be generating fewer returns, and that might have an impact on future CPI increases, the pensioners decided that they wanted to divest of themselves of this plan, to liquidate the plan, and basically just take a lump sum distribution for their share. There are two pensioners, as I mentioned. They believe that, at least one of them believe that they can get a better return and effectively get a higher monthly pension than they're getting today. They also recognize there's value in having money in hand, lump sum, versus having just a monthly pension, because if somebody were to pass away, they would not be entitled to any of those monies, whereas if they had it in hand, it could be passed on to heirs. And of course, they wouldn't be subject to the same city's trustees fees that the city charges today. So these are the reasons why they decided they thought it would make more sense for them to liquidate and get a lump sum distribution. So they did mention that they wanted to have one more chance to make sure that they were comfortable with this. So even with council's approval today, presumed approval, that they would want to, we're meeting this Friday to make sure that they are okay with all this. But they just incidentally, they also recommended that the council contribute the $129,000 that is the actual unfunded liability in this plan, to bring it up to a total of about $500,000 that would then be liquidated and distributed to the two pensioners. It's not conditioned on their decision to liquidate the plan entirely or terminate the plan. They just thought they would ask if the council could make that kind of contribution to bring the plan whole before they liquidate the plan and distribute those to the two pensioners.
What happens if we don't follow that recommendation and don't add in the 129?
They would just be we would be distributing the assets that are there, approximately $420,000, so they would split that versus a higher number.
I move we adopt recommendation A.
But not B. The staff recommendation is that we do the 129, right?
No, it's not. We're just asked. They asked. I'm just passing on their request for the council to consider this. The staff is, I didn't want to presume to make that recommendation,
Okay.
in light of the fact that we're kind of in a budget crunch right now, and we're having to make cuts across the departments. so I didn't want to presume that.
All
But
right,
it's
then I'll
certainly-
second it.
Excuse me. Any more discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed and abstain? Thank you.
All right,
Our meeting is adjourned.
thank you.